From distress-driven deals to deliberate dominance. Over the next 5 episodes of Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology by Prasad Arnala, we'll reveal how rethinking biotech licensing as a primary path can safeguard IP, empower founders, and fuel sustainable innovation.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are opening up a topic that usually gets whispered about in the back of boardrooms, but rarely addressed on the main stage. We're dissecting the uncomfortable reality of the exit in industrial biotechnology. Not the IPO, ringing the bell at the NASDAQ, and not the multi-billion-dollar acquisition that makes the front page. We are talking about licensing.
Right. Specifically, the messy, friction-heavy, and often, let's be honest, desperate transition from a lab bench breakthrough to a commercial product.
It is the elephant in the incubator, isn't it? For the last decade, the venture-backed narrative has been so singular, almost religious. You build, you scale, you become this vertical giant.
Yeah, the next Genentech or the next Solagen. And if you license your technology to an incumbent, essentially handing over the keys to a chemical giant, it's viewed as a consolation prize. It's the plan B because you couldn't raise the Series B.
Exactly. The prevailing view is that licensing is a distress-driven event. The startup runs out of runway, it panics, and it sells its intellectual property for pennies on the dollar just to keep the lights on. But we're looking at a body of research today, specifically a policy review on reframing licensing, that suggests this narrative is not just wrong, but economically destructive. So the core question we're tackling is this: can we reframe licensing from a sign of failure into a value-optimized strategic outcome?
And, more controversially, should public policy be funding the boring, unsexy work of transfer readiness just as aggressively as it funds the scientific breakthrough itself? That's where I start to get skeptical.
How so?
Well, I understand the premise. If you package the technology better, you get a better deal. But I worry we're trying to solve a hard market problem with a soft bureaucratic solution. You're suggesting we treat transfer readiness, writing manuals, standardizing data, all that, as a fundable capability? To me, friction in the market exists for a reason. It filters out the noise. If we start subsidizing the paperwork, are we just propping up companies that should have failed?
I think that filter is broken. My position is that the current ecosystem actively forces startups into distress. We fund technical milestones, making the cells grow, getting the yield up in a beaker, but we do not fund the operational readiness required to actually hand that process over. We're creating what I'd call operational fragility. We build these scientifically brilliant companies that are structurally unsellable until they're desperate.
So we're building Ferraris with no wheels.
That's it, exactly. And then we wonder why they can't drive off the lot. My position is we need to fund the wheels.
Is truly revolutionary. If you have cracked the code on a fermentation titer that changes the unit economics of a commodity chemical, the leverage exists naturally. My fear is that by focusing on licensing readiness too early, we're distracting founders from the only thing that matters, the science. Distress, as harsh as it sounds, is a price discovery mechanism. It tells you what the asset is actually worth.
It's a harsh mechanism, and I'm arguing it's an inefficient one that destroys value. But let's dive into the position statements to really unpack this.
Go ahead, make the case.
Well, the physics and economics of industrial fermentation. We have to stop pretending this is software. In SaaS, you deploy code to a server and you're done. Scaling up a bioprocess requires massive capital intensity. Steel tanks, downstream processing, complex QA systems, waste treatment.
So you're saying for most of these companies, independent scale-up is a fantasy?
For 90% of them, yes. It is simply not realistic to raise the hundreds of millions required. So for the vast majority, licensing is the most rational route to market. The problem is we have an incentive mismatch. Our grants and early-stage equity, they pay for headline technical progress, the proof of concept. Look, we made the molecule. But what do licensees, the big chemical companies, actually pay for? They don't pay for a cool result in a flask. They pay for transferability and legal certainty.
But surely, if the science works, the transferability just follows. If the biology is sound, the engineering is just engineering.
That is the trap. That is exactly where these companies die.
Because we don't fund the creation of standardized data sets or codified know-how, the startup ends up with operational fragility. They have a great result in the founder's hands, but no process that moves, so they wait. They burn cash trying to raise that next round for a pilot plant they can't afford, and when they finally try to negotiate, they're out of money. This leads to distress-driven terms. We need policy that incentivizes this licensing readiness before the bank account hits zero.
All right, I hear the tragedy in that timeline. I do. But let me push back with a market skeptic view. I acknowledge that independent scale-up is brutal. I'm not denying the CapEx reality, but I really question your proposed solution. You're talking about information asymmetry, the classic lemons dynamic, where the buyer assumes the seller is hiding flaws. That's a structural reality of selling complex science. It's not just a funding gap.
But it's a gap we can bridge with better data.
Is it? If you push a seed stage startup to focus on standardization and documentation before they've even proven the core science, you're bleeding resources from the actual innovation. You're asking them to polish a car that doesn't have an engine yet. And what's more, I believe distress acts as a necessary filter. If an incumbent waits until the startup is desperate, it's not just predatory. It's the market saying, we don't know if this works, so we aren't paying a premium. If the technology was truly a must-have, the leverage would exist regardless of whether the lab notebook was standardized.
But that implies the market has perfect information, and it doesn't. The incumbent can't know if it's a must-have because the data is a mess. Which I think brings us to the core debate, because I want to challenge this idea that documentation is a distraction. I want to talk about the readiness stack versus the hero batch.
The hero batch being that one perfect run that founders put in a pitch deck?
Exactly. The source material highlights this vividly. We have a culture that rewards the hero batch, proving something is possible. The grant report asks, did you achieve 5 grams per liter? If you did it once, on a Tuesday with the wind blowing the right way, you check the box. But a licensee needs to know it's reproducible. My proposal is that funding agencies need to support the creation of a transferability package.
And what exactly goes into that package? Because if it's just a glorified lab notebook, I'm not impressed.
It's significantly more. We're talking about standardized data sets and, crucially, defined operating envelopes. You need to show ranges of critical process parameters, CPPs. What happens if the temperature spikes 2 degrees, or if the stirring rate drops? You need to show that the quality attributes remain stable.
Every 3 months. To define a stable operating envelope, that feels like premature optimization. In the early days, you're hunting for the outliers. You're looking for that hero batch to prove the biology can even work. If you demand reproducibility across runs too early, you might kill a promising innovation because it looks unstable, when really it just needs more time. Time that's being spent on your paperwork.
I'm not convinced by that. Because it creates a cliff. It assumes you can do the science first and the documentation later. But biology is messy. Without funding, know-how continuity, things like run books, training protocols, all that tacit know-how remains stuck in the founder's head. We see this constantly. The founder just knows you have to tweak the pH at hour 12. It's not written down. It's muscle memory.
Tacit know-how is the dark matter of biotech. We know it's there, but you can't see it in the Excel sheet.
Precisely. And when that startup hits a cash crunch, that value evaporates. The buyer looks at the data and says, we tried to replicate this and it failed, or this relies on one genius scientist. If that value isn't packaged to move, it's worthless. We agree that tacit know-how is the dominant determinant of yield reproduction, right?
Oh, I will concede that. In fermentation, the art of the operator often matters as much as the strain. If the person who knows how to run the tank leaves, the yield crashes. It's like a chef's recipe. You can give me the recipe, but my souffle won't rise like yours.
So why not fund the extraction of that art? Why is that considered overhead rather than an asset? If we paid the startup to turn that art into a standard operating procedure during the grant phase, the asset becomes transferable. It becomes an industrial recipe, not a chef's secret.
Because the art is fluid. It changes every week. But okay, let's assume you're right and we fund this. Does it actually solve the problem? This brings us to point 2. Information asymmetry and the lemons market.
This is the heart of the negotiation failure.
Right, the big pharma licensee assumes the startup is selling them a lemon, a dud. so they discount the price. My question is, can a data room, no matter how standardized, really solve this? A savvy buyer knows you can cherry-pick data for a data room just as easily as you can for a pitch deck.
And that's why the source material proposes a new role for public institutions. We aren't just talking about the startup self-reporting. We're talking about public institutions as neutral validators.
Neutral validators? You mean like a certification body? A UL-listed sticker for yeast?
In a way, yes. Imagine safe-to-explore structures, where a third party, a national lab, or a specialized CRO oversees a validation run. This reduces what we call avoidable asymmetry. It's not the startup saying, trust me. It's a validated dataset saying, here's the performance, verified.
I see the appeal, I do. But I worry about the timing power. Even with a validated run, we're ignoring the financial reality. If the startup has 3 months of cash left, the incumbent knows they have the upper hand. They can just wait. They can drag out diligence until the startup is sweating. No amount of neutral validation changes the fact that one party has a balance sheet and the other doesn't.
And that is exactly why we must fund licensing readiness before the distress phase. That's the whole point. If the asset is process ready, IP boundaries clear, trade secrets partitioned, validation done, the startup can negotiate from a position of strength, maybe 6 months or a year before they run out of cash. They're selling a capability, not survival.
Which brings us to your third point, standardization. You mentioned WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has guidance on templates for term sheets.
Yes. The idea of standardized frameworks is crucial.
And this creates a visceral reaction in me. Licensing deals are inherently bespoke. Every molecule is different. Every strain is different. If you try to impose standard terms, you might erode strategic differentiation.
How so? Explain that fear.
Well, if every deal looks the same, how do unique innovations capture unique value? If I have a breakthrough that completely changes the economics of production, I don't want a standard royalty rate. I want to negotiate every line because my leverage is my uniqueness. Using a template feels like I'm signaling that I'm just a commodity.
I think that's a misunderstanding of what standardization means here. It's infrastructure, not constraint. We aren't dictating the price. We aren't saying every deal is a 5% royalty. We are setting baseline expectations for data and legal certainty. Think of it like a shipping container. The container is standard, it fits on every ship, but what you put inside can be cheap plastic toys or expensive electronics.
So you're standardizing the container, the legal framework, and the data format, not the contents.
Exactly. It's about reducing transaction costs. Right now, every negotiation starts from zero on definitions, on diligence access, on how to format the logs. That wastes time the startup doesn't have. These templates provide a floor. It makes it harder for incumbents to use opportunistic timing because the standard for what a ready asset looks like is public and clear.
I'll concede that legal certainty is valuable. I've seen deals fall apart because an IP assignment from 3 years ago wasn't signed correctly by an intern. So if standardization fixes those hygiene factors, that's a win. But I still warn against a rigid system that ignores the nuances of different biotechnologies.
Agreed. But the source material focuses on industrial fermentation, where the physics are somewhat universal. And speeding up the deal brings us to the final point, how we measure success.
Success metrics. This is where I think your view gets a bit idealistic.
I would argue the current metrics are delusional. We are measuring the wrong things.
We measure biobucks, headline deal value. Company X signs $500 million deal with Pharma Y. That's what attracts investors. It gets the headlines. You want to change that?
I do, because that $500 million is usually a mirage. In a distressed deal, that headline is back-end loaded with milestones the startup may never control. It's $10 million upfront and $490 million in contingent milestones.
Right, if you hit commercial scale. But the startup loses control of the process. If the licensee decides to shelve it, those milestones never hit.
Exactly. The source material argues we need to look at value retention distribution.
Value retention distribution. That sounds like an economist term for how much money did the founder actually keep.
Precisely. And capability retention. Does the know-how stay in the region? If we use public funds to build these companies, We should care if the expertise remains in the local ecosystem to build the next company.
I'm skeptical of those metrics. They're incredibly hard to track. Knowledge, spillover, these are lagging indicators that take years to materialize. Headline value is immediate. It signals to the market that a sector is hot. If you take away the big numbers, you might chill private capital. VCs operate on momentum.
But if the big numbers are fake, aren't we just inflating a bubble? If the deal is stress-driven, the headline masks the fact that the investors and founders got wiped out. We're celebrating the sale of the asset while ignoring the destruction of the ecosystem. If we funded licensing readiness, the startup could demand more upfront cash and fewer contingent milestones. They could negotiate a true price, not a survival price.
It's an interesting pivot. You're arguing that by making the asset more boring, more documented, more standard, you actually make the financial outcome more exciting for the founder.
ORIS is the new strategic. That's the essence of the argument. You reduce the discount for uncertainty.
I am starting to see the logic, even if my market instincts twitch a bit. But let's bring this to a close.
So where do you land?
Look, I'm still the dissenter. I believe the market is the ultimate arbiter of value, and I worry about any policy that keeps zombie companies alive by paying them to write manuals. Distress does clear the deadwood. However, I have to admit that operational fragility is a waste of public resources. If the science works, but the transfer fails because nobody wrote down the mixing speed, that's a tragedy.
An avoidable tragedy.
It is. And I agree that IP boundary cleanup is essential. You can't sell what you don't clearly own. So, while I don't want a bureaucracy of readiness, I can see the value in a readiness stack that runs in parallel to the technical work.
And I'll reaffirm that licensing must be a first-order strategic objective. We have to stop treating it as a failure of independence. We need to tell founders, building a company that can be licensed is just as noble and requires just as much skill as building a standalone giant.
And maybe more importantly, it requires different skills. Skills we are currently ignoring. It requires the skill of translation, translating science into an industrial package.
Exactly. Licensing readiness, transferability, legal certainty, standardized data is a capability as important as the science itself. If we want this ecosystem to mature, we have to stop treating licensing as a failure and start treating it as a success of knowledge transfer.
A success of knowledge transfer. I can live with that definition.
Thank you for listening. This has been The Debate.
As we sign off on this episode's look at treating licensing as a core objective, remember, the revolution in biotech is just beginning. Join us next time for policy shifts and sustainable wins. Follow and subscribe now to Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology by Prasad Ernala. Let's innovate together.